Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our session entitled Federal Government 101 Introduction to the Federal Legislative Branch. My name is Holly Bodie. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs at the American Kidney Fund, and I'm joined today by Ben Narella and Natalie Armillo from Federal Street Strategies. We work with them on much of our federal lobbying issues. Venn has spent over 20 years in senior roles in the legislative and executive branch, including the White House. Most recently, he served 4 years as Chief of Staff for Congressman Andy Levin from Michigan and previously served on the staff of 3 other members of Congress. Natalie has spent over 15 years in and around the government at the state and federal levels, working on issues ranging from defense and technology to healthcare policy. She began her career on Capitol Hill working with former Congresswoman and chairwoman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Congresswoman Michelle Lujan Grisham from New Mexico, serving as Deputy Chief of Staff and then Chief of Staff. Most recently, she served as a special projects lead for now Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham from New Mexico again. Once we get started, I want to encourage everyone joining to type your question and comments into the chat box. We'll try our best to get to all the questions during our Q&A segment at the end of this talk. So with that, I will turn it over to Venn and Natalie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Holly. And hi, everyone. What we can do, Brad, is go to the first slide there. And Natalie shared a bit about sort of our background, and we're currently with Federal Street Strategies. Natalie, I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about your sort of background before we jump into it.
Yeah, I'll just say good morning. We're excited to be here with you today. Ben and I, we work together for Federal Street Strategies. We're a multi-client lobbying firm. So we work on a range of issues from healthcare to financial services to tech, and we do a lot of outreach with the Tri-Caucus, which we'll talk a little bit more in our presentation.
Great, thanks, Natalie. So just a quick word before we go to the next slide. We want to talk about in the bit that we have this morning, talk about who the congressional players are that are relevant for AKF and your lobbying, your advocacy when you go up to the Hill. Committees of jurisdiction that are relevant for AKF. As Natalie mentioned, some of the caucuses that are germane, and give you a sense of congressional rhythm. It seems that there's always some sort of brinksmanship sort of happening, but sort of going through how it ought to be and sort of seeing, comparing that to what we've seen over the last several years. So why don't we start with a pop quiz, like any good presentation, I would argue. Our first sort of question is, how many members are there in the U.S. Senate? And let's, I think it's difficult to sort of have people shout out answers, so why don't we offer the answer, Brad? There are 100. And then the next question, how many members in the U.S. House of Representatives? Now, if you said 435, you would be right, but if you actually think about it, the 435 are the members who can vote on the House floor. And then there are 6 representatives, technically 5 delegates and 1 resident commissioner from all our territories, from Guam, American Samoa, Northern Marianas, DC, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico has the resident commissioners, what they call them. And then the next question, how frequently are senators and representatives standing for election? So why don't we show the the answer on that. If you said 6 years for the Senate and 2 years for the House, you would be right. So hopefully you're at 3 out of 3 so far. Why don't we go to the next slide? How are sessions calculated, and which Congress are we in? So every 2 years is a Congress, usually starting in an odd year and then finishing in an even year. So right now we're in the 118th Congress in the second session. And then November, of course, will be the election where senators, a third of the senators and all the House members will be up for re-election. So right now, who has the majority in the House and the Senate, and how many are in each chamber? So if you said Republicans in the House and Democrats in the Senate, you would be correct. There are 51 Democrats and 49 Republicans, and that includes on the Democratic side 2 independents, actually 3 independents. One of them, though, is leaving at the end of Congress, but still counts for this. Senator Sinema announced that she is leaving, or not standing for re-election. And then in the House, there are 219 Republicans and 213 Democrats. And as of last week, there were 3 vacancies. This, of course, in the House, we've seen the margins, both in the House and Senate, are very, very tight. And that's what we really have been seeing, is that really narrow majority is what's leading to a lot of the dynamics. Some uncharitable folks will call it dysfunction, but some of the dynamics that we're seeing. And the last question, which is useful for you to keep in mind, that you know, we're going to be talking about caucuses and committees, about ways members, you know, there are so many members, how they are sort of organized. One other way to conceive of this is through this last question. Members of committees, members of Congress sit on committees which either direct policy or direct spending. And so the folks who work on the Hill, folks who work with the Hill, as you advocate on the Hill, it's good to know these terms. People who direct, members who are directing policy are known as authorizers, and then members who are directing spending are appropriators. And so you need both parts working, both groups of people on their committees, to be able to create what we know as our annual budget, and then policy that sort of emerges from that. So why don't we go to the next slide? Hopefully you've gotten 6 out of 6 and are ready to move forward. Natalie and I will spend the next little bit talking about some of the congressional players. Important for you to put a face to a name, and here at least pictorially. The Senate, the House Republican leadership, this is the majority right now. If you remember last fall, last year when we did this presentation, we of course had a different picture for the speaker. And do y'all remember who that was? Right, that was Kevin McCarthy. And now, at the end of last year, last fall, a new speaker was elected, Speaker Johnson, from Louisiana. But the rest of the leadership team has stayed in place, with the majority leader, Scalise, the majority whip, Emmer, the conference chair, Congresswoman Stefanik, and the Republican Study Committee chair, Gary Palmer. And then the next slide, if we go to, we see the Democrats and the Democratic leadership of Majority Leader Jeffries, Minority Whip Clark, Democratic Caucus Chair Pete Aguilar, Democratic Vice Chair, Caucus Vice Chair Ted Lieu, and the Assistant Democratic Leader, Jim Clyburn. And then, Natalie, why don't you talk about the Senate side?
Sure, thanks, Ven. So, like Ven mentioned, so the Democrats and Republicans have their leadership on both the House and in the Senate, and all of these different leadership positions serve a purpose. For the Senate Democratic leadership, we have Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Chair of the Conference from New York. We have Majority Whip Dick Durbin from Illinois. We have Policy and Communications Chair Debbie Stabenow from Michigan. We have Vice Chair of the Conference, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and then we have Vice Chair of the Conference, Senator Mark Warner. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, like the Majority Leader, he runs the floor of the Senate. He brings bills to the floor, and he works with his counterparts on the Republican side as well. And the Majority Whip, and both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, have a whip, but the whip is the person who is whipping votes for if they have a bill coming to the floor. And oftentimes, if it's a very, very close vote, the whip is calling offices and members and trying to make sure that they're all on the same page, because they want their party to vote together. And so that's a really important role. If anyone ever wondered what a whip does. And then they also have conferences. So the caucus on the House side, and then the conference on the Senate side. And these are groups, they run, a weekly meeting. They come together to talk about the issues that week. And so they try to just stay on the same message. And so that's sort of the role of leadership. We can go to the next slide. Oh, and I'll just mention too, Senator Debbie Stabenow is retiring, and she's on the Senate Agriculture Committee. And so that's a really big role. We'll talk more about, there are different, bills that have to happen every year, or reauthorizations of legislation. And so she's working on the Farm Bill, but this entire Congress has sort of been unprecedented. So the Farm Bill is only authorized every 5 years, and it's been sort of kicked down the line. So it may be reauthorized this year, it may not, but that's sort of her role in it. So that's something we'll be watching since she is retiring. But back to the Senate Republican leadership, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, he is also retiring. He recently announced that he's not running for re-election. So now there are some internal dynamics of other Senate Republican senators who are running for that seat. We have Minority Whip John Thune. We have the Conference Chair John Barrasso, Policy Committee Chair Joni Ernst, and Conference Vice Chair Shelley Moore Capito. We can go to the next slide.
Great. So thanks, Natalie. We're going to spend a little time talking about committees of jurisdiction that are germane for AKF and for you to know about. You don't have to memorize all these things, but what's useful to know is that of all the standing committees in Congress, there are a few committees and a few subcommittees. One is the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and the other is the House Ways and Means Committee. And Natalie will talk about the Senate side ones as well. And then, as we were talking about earlier in the quiz about directing spending and directing policy, the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee both are responsible for directing policy. Because there's such an interest in health from a couple of different angles, that the House Energy and Commerce Committee has a subcommittee on health, just as the House Ways and Means Committee. And Ways and Means is a committee that sort of focuses broadly in this context about taxes and taxation and raising funds, not spending funds, but raising funds for the various parts of government that are involved, in this instance, in healthcare. So there's a chairman, chairperson, chairwoman on each committee, and there's a ranking member. Because in the House, if you remember, the Republicans are in charge. The Republicans have a majority. You will have Republican members. The Republican numbers on the committees will be more than the Democratic members. And so the House, for example, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the chairwoman of the overall committee is a congresswoman from Washington State named Kathy McMorris Rogers, and the ranking member is a congressman from New Jersey named Frank Pallone. And if and when the House flips after an election, sometimes these roles are reversed. Some of the other dynamics that you see in an instance, Congresswoman McMorris Rogers announced that she's not going to run for re-election. So on the Republican side, they'll be reordering however the elections turn out in terms of having a chairperson, chairman, chairwoman, or a ranking member. And then similarly, House Ways and Means, Jason Smith and Richie Neal are the Republican and Democrat respectively. And then the subcommittees have their own chairman and ranking members as well. And then, so Natalie, why don't you talk about the spending committees then?
Sure, thank you. So like Ben had mentioned, we have authorizers and appropriators. So the House Appropriations Committee, they dictate where the money goes, how much is going to be spent within each committee. And so currently right now, you've probably seen in the news that and heard about a government shutdown and things like that. So this is what that has to do with. And so typically, and we'll talk about the rhythm of sort of Congress and what happens throughout the year. But typically, House appropriations for FY24, that's what we're voting on right now. These came out last year in 2023. And so these were supposed to be voted on late in 2023, but you've probably also heard a continuing resolution. And so this is the House has passed this and the Senate in order to keep the government funded. So they've extended the deadline for these appropriations bills to be funded. So last week there were a set of appropriations bills that were funded that passed, and then this week, today actually, the House is voting on the additional appropriations funds. And so it came together last night. So that's sort of the newest information that we have. You know, the House majority, the Republicans are in the majority. They met with the White House last night, and it seems that they've gotten all the bills put together. There's one bill in particular for Homeland Security that's been the most difficult to put together because of the border and immigration issues. And so there will be potentially, we don't know, things change so quickly in Congress, but there should be a continuing resolution for the Homeland Security bill. But the other bills will be funded today, hopefully. So that's great. So we won't be seeing a government shutdown this week. But you know, stay tuned. Things change. But I'll just talk about the House Appropriations Committee. Chairwoman Kay Granger, she's the chairwoman, and then the ranking member, who they always call the ranking member the person who is in the minority. So ranking member Rosa DeLauro. We have the Labor HHS Subcommittee. That's Chairman Robert Adderholt and ranking member Rosa DeLauro. And then we also have the Agriculture Subcommittee. And that's Chairman Andy Harris and ranking member Sanford Bishop. We can go to the next slide.
Great.
Ben, do you want to talk to just kind of give a brief overview, or I can too, about the committees on the Senate side?
Yeah, why don't you quickly go through that?
Okay, we don't have a slide up right now, but if anyone is interested, we can pass that along. The Senate also has their committees of jurisdiction. So once bills are funded and passed on the House, typically goes to the Senate, and then the Senate either amends these bills and then they vote on it. So in the Senate, the committees that are useful to American Kidney Fund, the Senate Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Committee. It's called the HELP Committee. And so their chairman, Bernie Sanders, leads that with ranking member Bill Cassidy. And then we also have the Senate Health Subcommittee. And so that's why that's important. It's the chairman, Ed Markey from Massachusetts, and ranking member Roger Marshall. Then we also have the Senate Finance Committee, Chairman Ron Wyden and ranking member Mike Crapo. Senate Finance Health Subcommittee, and Chairman Ben Cardin and ranking member Steve Daines leads that. And then just a few others are the Senate Appropriations Committee. So that's a really important one, just like we were talking about appropriations. And so Chairwoman Patty Murray leads that, and ranking member Susan Collins. And we have the subcommittee, the Labor HHS Subcommittee for Appropriations. And we have the Appropriations Subcommittee in Agriculture. And just to give you a little background too, these in terms of you engaging with members on the Hill and senators, it's really important to identify what committees they sit on, because they can be more helpful in terms of passing legislation or getting support on different issue areas if it's important to them. So that's why we kind of talk about the Senate Health Subcommittee, or also the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee on the House side. Those are good examples of members that we would reach out to in terms of gaining support for our priorities.
I think that's a really good point to underscore, Natalie, which is, knowing the committees of jurisdiction that are germane for AKF's work. Of course, we want to say that, everyone is important in Congress, but there may be instances where somebody from your state may be chairman or ranking member or a senior member of a given committee or subcommittee. So having those relationships is valuable in influencing the process. Natalie, why don't you start with the caucuses then?
Yeah. So in Congress and on the Senate, we have caucuses, and so like we mentioned, the Democratic Party has their caucus, and then the Republican Party has their conference. And so those are like the major party caucuses. But within Congress, there are hundreds of different caucuses. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But really, it could be, there's a Senate pickleball caucus. Anything you could think about, there's probably a caucus for it. That those things that members are passionate about, and it helps members build relationships with one another too. So they come together with mutual passions, and they work together on those issues. But a caucus, it's an informal organization of members of the House or the Senate or both. And these exist to discuss issues of mutual concern and possibly to perform legislative research and policy planning for its members. And then you can break these down back into regional, political, or ideological, ethnic, and economic-based caucuses. And I'll just say that some caucuses are small. Maybe there's only a few members. But then there are other larger caucuses who actually have dedicated staff to those caucuses. And in terms of like a regional caucus, I'll give an example. There's the Southwest caucus, and so it's members from the Southwest in the U.S. And I recently asked one of the congressmen on that caucus. I said, "Who's a part of your caucus?" And he said, "It's just us two." So that's a good example, and hopefully it's brand new caucus, so hopefully they get more support. But that's sort of just an example of a regional caucus. Then we have ideological caucuses. So we have the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We call it CPC. We have the New Dems, Blue Dogs. And so the Blue Dogs are typically more moderate Democrats. And so they come together and they work on issues also with just in terms of if there's legislation that's sort of on the line and could go with Republicans or it could go with the Democrats. So that's what the Blue Dogs Caucus is. We have the Problem Solvers Caucus, and so the Problem Solvers, this is a mix of Democrats and Republicans that work together to try and pass legislation, bipartisan legislation. We have the Freedom Caucus, which is on the Republican side. We have the Republican Study Committee and the Main Street Coalition. And it's noted here the Dem Caucus and the Republican Conference. That's to discuss the party issues. I talked to that, and then the party leadership, they work together to ensure that they come together as a party and they're on message and they're voting on the issue together. And sometimes, depending on your district and who your constituents are, it can be a difficult vote for some members because every district and every state all has their own issues, and so no district is the same. And so that's what members of Congress do. They come together to make sure that they're doing the work for their constituents and what betters them. And then lastly, we have the affinity caucuses. And I mentioned this in the beginning that our team at Federal Street Strategies, we do a lot of work with the Tri-Caucus. So we have the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. And within these three caucuses, the Tri-Caucus, there are over 100 members. And so they really are a large portion of the Democratic Party. And so these are really important, members to meet with because they do have the representation and the power to do more for minorities and people of color, and especially in districts that have a larger population of minority communities. I'll talk. I think that's all I have to say on that. Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about CPC and New Dems?
Yeah, I think that, thanks, Natalie. A couple of things I think to note that as Natalie was describing the spectrum on the Republican side, it's very similar on the Democratic side with the progressives being more center-left, the New Dems being sort of centrist, and the Blue Dogs occupying the space of sort of center right slightly, depending. They're all inexact sort of definitions, but you sort of see on what people focus on. But then at the end of the day, when the leader of the Democrats or the leader of the Republicans, the Speaker of the minority leader, need votes, everybody is an American first and then a party person second. If we go to the next slide, we can actually touch on caucuses that are germane to AKF and the work that you all do. Just as examples, as you're going in, talking to people, you may find instances where they may be a progressive Democrat, but they're also a member of the Black Maternal Health Caucus. And so we sort of offer these as ways to connect the dots between things that you maybe you care about, you've had experience with, and ways to connect with members. The Congressional Diabetes Caucus is an example, and of course, number one, in this instance, of course, the Congressional Kidney Caucus that Congresswoman Del Bene and Congressman Bouchon lead. And then on the Republican side, there's a GOP Doctors Caucus. So these are examples. It's not exhaustive. I think I counted once to Natalie's point that there are 550 caucuses. I'm happy to share the link if anyone's interested, where you can look up every caucus. And that's an idea too. If there are particular caucuses that you think don't exist but ought to be there, I mean, that's a little campaign in and of itself, but something to talk to AKF about and see if that's something that could be created or gets subsumed in the work of another caucus. If we go to the next slide, talk about congressional. What we'll see actually. Natalie was talking about appropriations, and this is actually an example of some of the work and advocacy and how it ends up. We all know spending, the spending happens through the Appropriations Committee, but there's one other feature, which is report language that comes out with every bill every year. Excuse me, and this is an example of in 2020, this is from the FY21 Labor HHS bill, and this is language on end-stage renal disease that Congress that Congress has put a marker down. And let me quickly share what this says. It says the committee, so they're talking about the Appropriations Committee, notes the work in supporting critical kidney research, including ESRD, that NIDDK has accomplished. This research has led to new developments for possible treatments, and the committee continues to encourage NIDDK to work with stakeholders to facilitate new opportunities for research. So this is an example of the work and advocacy that you all do, and how it sort of manifests itself. And this is language that will be here forever, right? This shows that in this point in time, Congress sought to opine about ESRD and its relationship with NIDDK's research. And so every year there are opportunities to sort of think about and see if Congress can focus not only on ensuring certain levels of funding, but also offering an opinion on some of these things. And this is an example as well where even though we were pointing out that spending bills are dealt with appropriations, here's an example of a policy language that comes up, and they of course work with the policy committees, the authorizing committees, to insert language like this. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so Natalie, do you want to talk a bit about the congressional rhythm?
Yeah. So I mentioned this a bit earlier. So in a perfect congressional world, this is sort of the calendar of how Congress functions and works. Things have been, probably the last decade have changed a little bit. So you've heard more about government shutdowns and continuing resolutions and things like that. But the budget, so the president, he sends his budget request in February, March. That recently came out. So President Biden sent his budget request to Congress, and now they are sifting through that language, and saying what, like, no, we don't want to add additional funding here, or we want to add more additional funding in this area. So the House and the Senate do go through this budget and review it. So the House and Senate review and propose their versions of the budget and funding levels. And then these resolutions are sent to the floor for a vote. And then that goes to the House, back to the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. And so the Appropriations Committee, they'll meet typically in March, because that's when appropriations requests are due. And so just for an example, we're still currently voting on FY24 funding, which should have been voted on last year. But as we're voting on it today, the already FY25 appropriations report language and requests have been submitted. So I know that certain offices already had deadlines last week for appropriations requests. And so we continue to move forward, even if we're still, you know, in the previous fiscal year. So then these annual appropriations bills are considered on each chamber's floor. These are usually beginning in early summer, and appropriations bills are supposed to be signed by the president by 10/1 to avoid a government shutdown. So a lot of times you hear September 30th, that's the end of the fiscal year, and we want to try to pass a budget for a year. And so then that typically what happens is we have an omnibus or a continuing resolution. So if we can't come to an agreement, then usually the House and the Senate pass a continuing resolution, a CR, in order, which keeps the previous funding at the same levels in order to keep the government open. So appropriations bills, they're sometimes packaged into a larger bill called an omnibus, or into smaller bills called a minibus. So you may hear that language in the news. And typically that will happen at the end of the year. And if these bills aren't completed by the end of the year, then, like I said, a CR will be passed to avoid that government shutdown. And it's just a temporary spending bill. So, but we operate at the same levels as the previous year. So we can go to the next slide. And then so expiring authorizations, I mentioned one earlier, the Farm Bill. But so the Congressional Budget Office, it's CBO, they track authorizations of appropriations that have specified expiration dates. And so every now and then you'll hear different authorizations are expiring. So expiring authorization, these need reauthorization through Congress, which can be more difficult because sometimes these need more funding. And so the House and the Senate, the House Republicans and Democrats have to come to an agreement on whether or not we're going to reauthorize these bills and at what funding levels, and then that goes to the Senate. And so community health centers, that's an important one, especially for American Kidney Fund, reauthorizing those health centers. And then you've likely heard the NDAA, that's the National Defense Authorization Act. And within the NDAA, these are, it can be all sorts of different funding requests. And so it's from national security, could also be some health issue areas, health funding. So the NDAA is a vehicle that members and the House and Senate use in order to get funding done that wasn't done through appropriations. So there are different vehicles sometimes if we weren't able to get funding or report language into the appropriations bills. And then the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is reauthorized every 5 years. So my former boss, when I worked for Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, when she was a congresswoman, she sat on the House Agriculture Committee. And so in 2018, in our final year, that was when the Farm Bill was up for reauthorization. And within the Farm Bill, you know, this has a lot to do with USDA funding for farmers. There are some health vehicles in there too that sometimes come through with different programs. But right now, so the Farm Bill should have been reauthorized in September of last year. It's been pushed. They extended it, and hopefully they will be voting on a Farm Bill in this fall. Like I said, it's sort of been unprecedented this year, and so we've tried. I try not to make predictions anymore because I think anything can happen. But one more thing about the Farm Bill, that's a lot where you see SNAP benefits, WIC benefits for moms. So there's a lot of like nutrition aspects to that too, which I think does, go back to the American Kidney Fund and your issue areas because, some people who are on dialysis or not able to work, they depend on these types of funding. So, but yeah, so that's in a perfect world that all happens, but things are a little bit different nowadays. But just so you have an understanding of that. Next slide. And that's it. So that's our presentation. I guess we can go to questions and answers. If anyone has any questions about what we talked about or any of your priority areas, we're happy to answer. we're having a small technical issue, so we'll get Holly's mic back up. But if you want to start putting, any questions, and we're happy to, we can start that soon.
Natalie, I know that there was a question that we got earlier about how to find out who your representatives and senators are. Maybe we can speak to that.
Yeah. So, that's a really important question, actually, is who is your member of Congress and who is your senator. So all states have 2 senators. So you have 2 that you can choose from that you would want to reach out to. And then depending on your state, depending on the districts, there's various, levels of members. So like from New Mexico, we only have 3 members of Congress, but California, there's many members of Congress. But you can go to kidneyfund.org/advocacy, and you can type in your zip code there, and you can find out who your member of Congress is and your senator. And typically you can reach out to them. So if you're having an issue with your health care or reimbursements for medical issues or anything like that, you should and can reach out to your member of Congress's office in their district. And so they have constituency services. So we would get calls all the time, and it's probably the biggest part of our job. And so we want to help our constituents. So, feel free to reach out in that sense to your district office. And if you're ever in Washington, D.C. with family, friends, or on your own, you can always reach out to your member office and set up a meeting to talk with staff. And also just like a little perk, when you're here and you're coming and you need to plan, you're planning ahead, you can also ask for Capitol tours and things like that. So they're there to help you, which is great. But you can go to kidneyfund.org/advocacy to find out who represents you.
I don't know if Holly is back.
I am not.
Oh no, I hear you.
I can hear you now, Holly.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. Apologies for the technical difficulty. A question that we just got in is, why are so many House Republicans retiring?
Yeah, I can talk to that, and then if Ben may have some feedback too. I do think that a lot of House Republicans are retiring, and some Democrats too, some key Democrats, just because of the dynamics right now in Congress. I think some people are ready to retire. They're ready to pass the torch on, but the dynamics too within Congress have become just unprecedented. And so it is frustrating for them because they want to pass legislation and get things done for their districts. And it's been difficult to do so. But I would say, there's so many different reasons why the Republicans are retiring and Democrats. But I do think that that's probably one of the issues at the forefront right now.
Yeah, I think Natalie, you're spot on, but it's very different for every member. So I think dynamics is an important point, though.
Another question that's come in is, who do we contact if we want to schedule a meeting with our elected officials?
Yeah, so if you go to the website that we gave you, you can find out who your representative is or your senator. You can look them up online. They all have their own personal individual websites. They have their contact information on there. Some have a contact page that you can submit. But I would suggest, just from experience in working in Congress, I would definitely just reach out by phone, call, set up a meeting. If you're in Washington, D.C., there's a scheduler. You can set up a meeting with them, or you can talk with someone in your district office.
And one thing I would add is this is also an example of developing relationships with staff. As you're doing your advocacy, don't let that be the only time you're in touch. Look for other ways. Holly and Katie and Deb can all help uh, in facilitating those relationships.
Thank you. Another question is, what is the most effective way, if you can't be there in person, what is the most effective way to communicate with your members of Congress? Is it through letters? Is it through social media? Is it phone calls, emails? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would say phone calls and emails. Find who your point of contact is in the office. Feel free to email them, keep in touch with them. You feel free to go, set up a meeting to meet with them in your district office, or if you're in Washington, D.C. But I do think that phone and email is best. You can write a letter, but I would even give them a heads up, say, hey, you know what, I'm sending you a letter so that they know that it's coming, because we do receive a lot of mail. We do get a lot of letters online, so that there is an option too. So we have someone specifically dedicated to that in the office who answers questions that come into the office. So we field those, and we usually direct that to the proper staff. So I would say, keep in touch with your members and the district staff, and in Washington, D.C. They do begin to know you. There are always people that we would have in our office that were kind of regulars, and it was great because we also use them as a resource. Sometimes they reach out to you. So I do think it's important to build that relationship.
Thank you. I think one more question, actually two more questions. So what is the importance as a constituent, if you're going in to meet with your member of Congress or your senator, how important is it that they hear from constituents, and what is the impact of people's stories on their member of Congress and their staff when they have a meeting?
Yeah, I mean, I would say for members, constituent issues and their constituents in the district is their number one priority, because that's who also votes for you. That's why you're in office and serving the people of your community. And so I would say most offices that is what they prioritize. So I do think it is important. Members of Congress are regular people just like us, and with various different backgrounds. A lot of members have similar personal stories that relate to you, and so I do think that they offer a lot of guidance and insight there. So I mean, I do think feel free to reach out to the office and work with them, because that is the number one priority. And Holly, I may have missed the last part of the question, or maybe I answered it totally, but
you answered it.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Yeah.
I would just underscore Natalie's point. I think she's absolutely spot on. And I know that members I worked for would frequently use stories that we had in constituent meetings on the floor, when talking to other members. So very, very valuable.
Thank you both. We got a question that I think I actually will try to answer, and it says, what legislation can we use or change to cover young adults who are too old to be covered by their parents' Medicare, or too young to have enough credits to qualify for Medicare? So what I will say about this is that Medicare only covers the individual. It does not provide family coverage. And then sometimes Medicaid, which is a program that is aimed at people with fewer resources. Sometimes if each state has their own Medicaid program, and so it would really vary from state to state if a child or a young adult is eligible to be on Medicaid along with their parent. What I will say about that, and this is making sure that everyone has access to health insurance is something that's really important to many members of Congress. And the Affordable Care Act, which is celebrating its 14th anniversary this month, provides coverage. Young adults can stay on their parents' coverage up to age 26. And there are also subsidies available to young adults that they can purchase their own coverage. And so I would say look into Affordable Care Act coverage. And again, this is something that's always at the forefront for many members, is making sure that Medicaid, Affordable Care Act, et cetera, is available to people of all ages to do what Congress can to make sure that everyone has access to health insurance. Another question that we received, and I'll turn this over to Ven and Natalie. Is it true that legislative aides review the constituents' vote history, and that tells them if they really want to listen to them?
Yeah, I can answer that. So I would say 100% no. Does it happen maybe in another office? I can't speak to that, but I mean, we receive in an office hundreds of requests and letters every day, and so that's not feasible. But also, we are there to serve Republicans and Democrats, so it doesn't matter who you voted for. We still represent you, and so that does not come into play at all. So don't be afraid to reach out. I wouldn't be concerned about that at all. They really are there to serve you. And even for example, we in my office, we would have we had a gentleman in our district who was mentally ill, and he called our office probably 10 times a day. But he was still very, very important to us because he's a constituent and he is having issues with his health and different things. So it was important to us that we don't ignore those types of situations. You want to help these people. That's what we're there for. So don't be afraid to be the squeaky wheel. If you're having an issue, squeaky wheel gets the oil, or whatever the saying is. But if you're having an issue, I would continue to call and reach out. And you also have your 2 Senate offices, but don't let that hinder you from calling.
Thanks, Natalie. Well, that is the end of our time today. And I just want to say thanks so much to Natalie and Ben for joining us. It was really informative and we really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for attending. I encourage everybody watching and listening to learn about AKF's advocacy priorities and to find out how to get involved in our website, which is kidneyfund.org/advocacy. Our next session is our congressional briefing on rare kidney disease, and it starts at 11 o'clock. Congressman Bill Arakis, who is the co-chair of the House Rare Disease Caucus, will kick off the meeting. So thank you again, everyone. Thanks so much to Natalie and Ben, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Holly. There's some cherry blossoms for you from the US
Oh, yes,
Capitol.
beautiful. Thank you.
Bye now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.